Zdaj mi je pa v izredno veselje, da lahko predstavim in povabim k besedi našo prijateljico, sodelavko, veliko strokovnjakinjo na področju izobraževanja odraslih, zelo prisotno v mednarodnih krogih. Vidite, pri njenem imenu piše, da je generalna sekretarka Mednarodne zveze za izobraževanje odraslih, ki je pred kratkim tudi slavila na CONFINTEI, o tem vam bo povedala. Če bi pa morala povedati samo 3 besede o njej, bi rekla strast, sočutje in modrost. So, passion, compassion and wisdom. The floor is yours.
Dobro jutro, good morning everyone. I'm extremely glad that I'm here again with my friends and colleagues from Slovenia, and thank you, Zvonka, for this lovely introduction. I hope you don't mind if I speak English. I do understand quite a lot of Slovenian, and I could enjoy the lovely presentations yesterday, but I feel more comfortable if I speak English. So after some break where we kept in touch through online media and so on, so it's a great opportunity to be alive here again, discuss and exchange. But I met some of you from the Slovenian delegation in Marrakesh at the CONFINTEA VII conference, and that's what I'm invited to talk about today. So, let me just see. I just use this. Yeah, okay, thank you. So, International Conference on Adult Education, UNESCO conference, it's not any conference. It's the conference that happens once in 12, 13 years. Last one was in Brazil, in Belém, 2009. So this is the biggest and the most important international event that we have in adult education. This is a kind of a milestone conference that gives us guideline and tell us about the tendency, tell us about what will be the priorities or what should be the priorities in the coming 12 or 13 years. So since Brazil, we have been waiting for this conference and preparing for it. Now, it's still fresh, we are still kind of digesting what happened there, but still I'm glad to share with you some of the insights from the conference, and of course some background stories and some tendencies that we see coming. So, oh, that's quite fast. As I said, we have been preparing for years. When I say we, I mean we as experts in academia, analyzing the documents, analyzing the tendencies. Also, we in a civil society, and my organization that Zvonka mentioned, International Council for Adult Education, is a global network of a civil society. So academia and civil society have been preparing for quite a long time. Well, that's not what I can say for UNESCO. They started quite late. One reason, of course, is COVID-19, so we didn't know what will happen. But the other reason might be an indicator for decreased interest in adult education. So when I say this, I can mention that regional preparatory meetings were held. Of course, all of them were online. And as you know, it wasn't so powerful as it used to be before the Belém conference. The GRAIL 5, the famous report that we all try to contribute, was prepared, but without participation of civil society. We even didn't know who was the focal point in the countries. Usually it's within the ministry and civil society is informed, so civil society, experts, academia, we take part. This time that was kept as a secret. In some countries, and I guess Slovenia might be among them, civil society was directly invited by the government or by the ministry. But in many others, it was not the case. That was one of the best kept andragogical secret last year. Who was preparing GRAIL 5 report? There was a group who prepared a so-called consultative committee, and we have organized consultations, but everything was quite in short time. Like you have 10 days for the public consultations, just a few days for the national or regional consultation. Quite a rush, Quite a rush. Still, in spite of that, because we have been expecting that, ICAE and the civil society in the countries, in the regions, was prepared, and we were really reacting very fast and did our best to prepare and to be very active in the consultative committee. So I was, on behalf of ICAE, a member of this consultative committee, and that's also why I can give you a few background information, what was going on in the backstage, to put it that way. Here you can see, of course, two most important photos from CONFINTEA. On your left is the festive opening, the beginning, of course. And in the upper part, you see part of the Executive Committee Board of International Council for Adult Education. Why only part? Well, we were like a strategic group, you know, or like a group preparing for a battle. In one session, in another session, in the plenary, in the drafting committee. So all the time we were at the conference in different spaces, communicating at the same time on a WhatsApp group, and trying to be a kind of a watchdog, especially when it comes to final document, to the outcomes. And it did help. So let me start with the first Grail 5. That was presented at the conference, so long-awaited secret. Now it's available, you can read it, and I picked up only two most important messages from the Grail 5 that were promoted at the conference and that have influenced also the final document. First one was, well, a quite depressive note, that adult education does not reach those who need it most. In spite of all our efforts, it does not reach those who really need it. The groups were mentioned like disadvantaged, vulnerable groups, indigenous learners, rural population, migrants, older citizens, people with disabilities, prisoners. And I was really glad to see yesterday in the afternoon sessions in the working groups to see some of the great examples, best practice from Slovenia, what Slovenia is doing to reach those groups who are usually difficult to reach or who are vulnerable. And the second message was we need more resources. We need to invest in adult learning and education. Without investment, so everything is only rhetoric and the good wishes. So with these two main messages that were introduced, we have entered the conference. And then there were plenary sessions, the usuals, groups, and so on. In the background, drafting committee was working and preparing the final document. So what influenced the final document, sorry, okay. You see here a few documents that final outcome, framework for action, was based on. Of course, you see Sustainable Development Goals, you see recommendation on adult learning and education, you see Global Alliance for Literacy, because literacy is was a very important point. And I will like to draw your attention, let me see if it's working. Not really. Okay. This blue document, Reimagining Our Futures Together, so-called New Social Contract for Education. This is, I would say, the most important document we have currently in education, and probably the best one. Well, that's not usual typical UNESCO document. That's not usual typical UNESCO rhetorics. That's what we should do, blah, 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 but let's see. But it's a really good analytic document and a good starting point of the discussion. It was produced by the research department in UNESCO, not by policymaking department. So here is the structure of the document, of the final document that we have been fighting for. In the months before CONFINTEA, in the consultative committee, in the public consultations, in the regional meetings. I will not go to too many details. I will give you a few flashpoints from the documents, and then I will present you the main recommendations, and I will give you a few ideas about how we could, how it can develop. What are the flashpoints? Well, first one, let's say that as a civil society, we got much more than we have expected. The document is based on a human rights approach, which shouldn't be taken for granted in the current UN and UNESCO. So there is a human understanding of education as a human right, and it's about inclusion, participation, and so on. But I have to say this is the product of our really serious fight that we had at the very beginning. The first version of the document that was not available to the public was not like this at all. It, for example, it never mentioned learners. There wasn't a single word mentioning learners or learner-centered, the learner-centered approach, and so on. So, of course, we reacted vehemently there and changed quite a lot, and UNESCO accepted that. That's the first impression. When you read it, you see, oh yeah, that's good. That's what we as experts, as civil society, are fighting for. But let me underline, that wasn't the case, that wasn't the first version. Second point, second flashpoint, and of course you see Sustainable Development Goals. I mean, this is our Bible. You cannot do anything without referring to Sustainable Development Goals if you want to be taken seriously. So in the document and throughout the conference, we were referring to Sustainable Development Goals, which is quite good for adult education. Why? Well, we were pointing out that adult education is a human right, per se, should be guaranteed to everyone. But on the other hand, adult education is also a tool to achieve all other goals. Gender equality, reducing poverty, and so on, so many others. And it was useful to see that the adult education really has this power. So SDGs were a framework that we were moving through throughout the conference. Third one is the RAIL, the famous RAIL, and this is the abbreviation for Recommendation for Adult Learning and Education. And that was another fighting point that we had. RAIL captured, this is just to remind you, RAIL is capturing 3 main areas of adult education. First one, literacy and basic skills. Second one, continuing education and vocational skills. And third one, liberal, popular, civic community education. And the idea of RAIL and the recommendation is to keep all 3 of them important and balanced. There was a danger to lose it. And the first two versions of final document, Marrakesh Framework for Action, didn't refer to RAIL. This nice balance was lost, and we had a feeling that the third point, liberal, popular, community, civic education, might get lost. So we were pushing to mention RAIL as a reference point in order to keep all 3 areas balanced. 2 very important points throughout the document and in the whole conference: green transition, climate change, education for sustainable development, and second one, digital transition, and of course everything that has to do with the ICT and digital technologies. And of course you might think, well, yes, that's the reality and that's what we need. But of course in these policy and advocacy documents you always have to be careful to see what is behind. With this green transition, there was a danger to put whole adult learning and education under the umbrella of education for sustainable development. The first document was exactly that. First, education for sustainable development, climate change, green transition, and all other areas of adult education as subsectors or sub-areas, which doesn't really make sense, although we know how important education for sustainable development is and everything that has to do with the environment. But that was too much of a pushing it as a generic term, as an umbrella term. And second, digital transition, I will mention it again, a lot of push to the ICT and digital. Of course, thanks to COVID-19, we had to realize and to use the power of ICTs, but there was too much pushing to that. So as ESD, climate action was dominating the agenda and the discussion in the conference, and it's quite strong also in the final document. Literacy was something that we again needed to push. That was very weak in the first version of the document. So we from the civil society and we from academia, we had to remind UNESCO that there is almost 800 million fully illiterate people around the globe. 800 million. When I say fully illiterate, meaning people who are not able to read and write a single sentence. Estimation about functional illiterate adult people are around 3 billion, more or less. So it's still shocking. It's still shocking. So literacy was quite weak, and we had to push to have it very prominent in the agenda. And technology, learning in digital environments. So any session, not only the session on technology, but also session on other fields, had to end up with what technology can do about it. So these are the flash points, and now just a few words about main groups of recommendations. The whole structure might seem a bit strange. We are used to the Bell framework correction, and you probably remember policy, governance, financing, quality research. Now they did change, and to be honest, I still don't know what's the logic of this order, but we couldn't change it. So here it is. First set of recommendations was referring to the frameworks that should be established and governance arrangements. It was quite a lot about the dialogue. So experts should be consulted, academia, there is a need for a dialogue between the ministries, the dialogue in the world of work between workers and employers and so on, need to establish multi-sectoral platforms for the governance. So first one is very much about cooperation and dialogue at the national level, something that we could really be very glad about. Second one was about systems, and we were not happy even with the title. Redesigning system means, oh, all the countries already have a system, and it's a quite good one, but we need to redesign it to match the new needs, which is, of course, not true in many countries around the globe. And this is the document that should be valid in Africa, Latin America, Asia, not only in Europe. But okay, so that was accepted, redesigning the systems of adult learning and education. How can we do it? How should we do it? First, diversity of providers of adult learning education was underlined, with, of course, enough resources. Then increasing institutional capacities. And this is another point that we had to push quite strong, to include community learning centers. And when we say community learning centers, we mean Univerze or folk high schools and many other forms. So we pushed quite a lot to capture them in this final document. And flexible learning pathways. UN and UNESCO and UIL are very keen on having recognition of prior learning and these flexible pathways between formal and non-formal. These were the highlights about the system. Then, of course, quality is important. So my dear colleague Tanya will have a presentation on quality after me. So let's just mention that under this quality, first point, and for us the most important, key roles of teachers, educators, trainers, and facilitators. Again, the point that we were pushing for months and at the conference also, because it wasn't so welcomed at the beginning. So there was really a lot of fighting to have teachers, trainers, educators as a key point of the quality. Then the discussion about digital and Zoom and so on ended up with emphasizing, yes, it's important, but we still need face-to-face learning. Let's not forget it, and let's not forget that we need also to improve it further. We cannot just archive that as good old times and to continue online and Zoom. Gender, of course, very important topic. So gender curricula, gender-responsive curricula, gender-responsive way of collecting data, literacy that has, of course, very important aspect of gender and so on. Research and evaluation, and you again could think, oh yeah, of course it will be in the document. Again, in the first version of the document, research and academia and universities were not mentioned, not with a single word, which was shocking for most of us. I mean, how can you think of any field where you don't cooperate practice and policy with research and academia in order to improve it? So luckily, our fight was paid off, and it was included in the final version. This long paragraph, you shouldn't read it, so I put it all because this was the most important point of the discussion and of the fighting. So you can just pay attention to the last sentence where it says that we should allocate, this is the recommendation for the governments, at least 46% of GDP, or at least 15 till 20 of total public expenditure to education, and to increase the expenses out of that percentage to increase investments in adult education. Why am I saying it? Why am I underlying it? In Belém, in Brazil, those of you who were there remember we did not succeed. The governments did not want any mentioning of financial obligations, not at all. Here we were quite well prepared, and thanks to the governmental delegations, Slovenia was one of them. In the night before the final adoption of the document, we were pushing and strategizing, sending emails to UNESCO and so on, and finally this paragraph was adopted. So we can use it in our national or regional advocacy, and this is now nationally agreed. 140 countries agreed about this recommendation. Of course, it's still not promised that countries will do that, but at least having a common benchmark was very important. And there was another financial benchmark. Again, I draw your attention only to the last one, the target of 0.7% of GDP for official development assistance and development cooperation. This is very important for many countries in the world who receive donors' aid and who take part in development cooperation. This is dramatically decreasing, dramatically. Only a few countries really do respect this benchmark and invest 0.7 or more. The part that we agreed easily, all the participants almost, is the diversity, so including the diversity of learners, especially vulnerable ones, of course, increased participation, increased accessibility. Again, I was really glad to see yesterday some of the best practice examples from Slovenia. And again, you see that gender is in a focus, and cooperation between government, non-governmental bodies, academia, civil society was finally there. But having in mind the process before that, we were really glad that we could reach to that point. So, okay, now I'm stuck. We have the magician there. Not moving. Now, yes. Okay. Last recommendation is for international cooperation, but let's just mention that we needed, of course, at the global level to point out some of the countries, some of the regions in the world that are less developed, and of course talk about data collection, because this was one of the biggest problems, and we saw it in Grail 5. Data were not available from many, many countries, so this was an important message for international organizations who work and support adult education in these countries. So in the last part, let me mention a few tendencies that we saw during the conference, but not quite new. Some of them were also there before the conference in Marrakesh, but even after that, so that's what we see coming most probably in the years ahead. So first one is the question of right to education. And what you can see, and those of you who were in Slovenia, who were following online session, you remember that we were fighting for a right to education. UNESCO was pushing a right to lifelong learning. And we won. The document is about right to education and right to adult education. But after the conference, UNESCO is ignoring its own document, the document that was adopted. And now they promote like right to lifelong learning. The conference was about the right to lifelong learning, and here is the tweet of UNESCO UIL about we must recognize lifelong learning as a human right, not adult education as a human right. So if you think it's only the terminology, well, I can warn you, it's much more. It's much more, and here are a few risks. Okay, a few risks of this shift that we have. This is the tendency that we observe for already quite a long time. In the UN, in the discussions about sustainable development goals, this is very obvious. Adult education became an old-fashioned word, a word that you shouldn't mention. So everyone is talking about lifelong learning. But if you read the documents, if you go to the sessions about lifelong learning, you will see children and formal education. So there is a danger that we have accepted lifelong learning as a phrase, but it can probably, what is happening, it is swallowing up adult education. And the danger, the risk is that we lose adult education as a sector. So lifelong learning, and of course, especially in academia and in the civil society, we have embraced lifelong learning. This is a lovely idea. This is our philosophy. That's what we believe in. But we need a name for a sector. Within this lifelong learning context, we need a name for the sector. This is disappearing. No one wants to call it adult education, and if you go to UN or even to UNESCO, they will say, oh, come on, this is so old-fashioned to talk about adult education. Let's talk only about lifelong learning. And of course, another consequence or another risk is that we will lose our attempt, our effort to professionalize the field. Because you cannot have professionals in lifelong learning. You cannot have experts, very good in early childhood, babies, kindergarten, people in the third age, and so on. So if we don't have subsectors, we cannot have professionals, which is really undermining our work on quality. Then third risk and third danger is we are losing adults from this priority list. So when UNESCO and UN are giving recommendations to the countries, they say, yes, lifelong learning, create a policy of lifelong learning, and then you decide about priorities. And guess what happens? Every country decides, or most of the countries, especially in the developing world, they decide, yeah, our priorities are children and schools, of course. Who can deny that that's a priority? So we are losing adults from this context. Another very dangerous risk is that withdrawing of the state. So if it's lifelong learning and adults are independent, self-sufficient, self-organized, well, there is nothing we have to do. The state can withdraw and open the space for private financing, private providers. Whoever can afford education and learning, please go on. The state does not have the obligations. And that's happening already. This is not like just, oh, we have some fears. That's happening already in many countries around the globe. Oh, if you're adults, you're capable to organize lifelong learning for yourself, so the state and the governments are withdrawing. And in many parts of the world, there will be, or already is, a rejection of lifelong learning, not as an idea, because it's a great idea and it's proved, backed up by researchers. But there is a danger, and they say, look, in Europe and countries like Europe, right to education is recognized. But in many countries around the globe, it is not recognized. We still fight for right to education, right to adult education. They say, look, if you're older than 18, why should you learn? You missed what you had, so maybe you can try to compensate at home and maybe some second chance course, but that's it. So they're still fighting for that. So if we give them right to learning, they said, look, don't give me or take me away right to learning. I can do it in my home, on my computer, with my neighbors, and so on. Give me a right to education, because that's what the state is responsible of. So this shift from adult education to lifelong learning has a lot of risks, and they are happening already. So second tendency that was obvious before the COVID-19, but then it exploded, and it was very obvious in Marrakesh also, is use, but I put misuse of digital technologies. Why misuse? Of course, during COVID-19, we saw the potentials of digital technologies. It kept us connected. It kept learning going on in spite of the difficulties, in spite of the lockdown. We could reach some people in the parts of the world that were not so easy to reach before the use of digital technologies. But the risk is there, and the risk is to replace the traditional learning, I mean face-to-face, to replace it with the online. And here I'm showing a few illustrations of that. First one is the COVID-19 response of UNESCO. So how universalizing access to digital technologies can help to match the consequences of COVID-19. This is like the most important recommendation. How can education help? By teaching digital skills, which is fine. But is this all that we can offer in education? How should we wash hands and learn digital skills? That's the contribution of adult education to COVID-19. That's not enough. That's by far not enough. Then on the right side, you see Sophia, the first robot. and very much improved. So the idea of using robotics, but again, it might be useful, but it goes a bit too far. Of course, it's not surprised that the first country that gave citizenship to Sophia is Saudi Arabia. I mean, when it comes to human rights, we could have some worry about Sophia. And you see that was very, very recent forum on artificial intelligence and education. World's Teachers' Day just happened 2 weeks ago. And there was a lot of rhetorics about teachers, how important they are. And just after that, they announced artificial intelligence that should help teachers. Well, again, using of technology and misusing. Again, it's not only fear. They're already doing that. There are projects in some of the African countries supported by the World Bank where they replace teachers by artificial intelligence or by online learning platforms and computers and computer programs. So it's happening already. And what are the risks of this misuse? First, the big part of population might be excluded. Half of the world is not online. Approximately half of the global population is not online, does not have access to Wi-Fi and to internet. This might lead also many groups behind, not only those that are not online, but for example, many of those who are afraid of learning and teaching and new technologies. Those who are illiterate, it's very difficult to reach them if you don't have a human factor included. Those who need motivation, those who need empowerment. Empowerment became a kind of a forbidden word. No empowerment, digital skills. And we know illiterate people, they need more empowerment than anything. They are capable, they are clever, but they believe they are not capable of doing anything, they're not capable of reading and writing, so they need empowerment and motivation. We might lose them also if we don't include human factor. What is also happening is a kind of shift, teaching what and why, which is still, I would say, the most important question for education. What are we teaching and why, what for, is replaced by how, which is a mean, a tool, technology, or any other tool, didactical tool. So the focus, global focus, is very much shifted to the digital technologies, and I dare to say one of the reasons is because of the influence of the big companies on the UN and UNESCO, and this is not a kind of a secret, it's very obvious and very open, and they are defining the agenda. So it leads also to, that's a serious risk, to neglect training of trainers. That's happening in Africa. Why investing in teachers? I mean, there are so many, and we need years and millions. Let's simply send them computers and the good online programs and artificial intelligence assistant, and we don't need to invest in teachers. I don't need to explain you why this is dangerous. With this overuse of online and Zooms and so on, social emotional learning tends to be neglected. It's very limited. It's possible, of course, but it's very limited. And embodied learning. For many years and decades, we have been fighting in adult education to recognize that adults are not only brains and they bring only their cognitive functions to the teaching and learning, but also social, emotional, embodied, and so on. And I was glad to see dancing session yesterday. Now, that's what can get lost if you focus only on online. Another, more from the policy aspect, another big risk is shifting the agenda. Who is creating the programs? Who is creating the content priorities? Who is creating those programs that we are enjoying? Well, there is always someone behind this program, but it's not transparent anymore. So we don't know who is really behind that, and that's what we need to know. If ministry is developing a program, there is a discussion, and everyone takes part, and there is a criticism, and public consultations, and so on. But if you receive an online program, nothing. It's just done by someone and accepted. And you can choose between one or second, third, and so on, but you're not taking part in the creating the agenda, defining the priorities, defining the content. And I see it as a big, big danger. And of course, it boosts the transhumanistic agenda, and I think for adult education, it's quite dangerous. Goes a bit too far with overusing the technology. Third, there are four all in all. Third one is the let's say, new global power architecture, things are changing dramatically. I have been exchanging with some of you yesterday also what's going on. We see a very serious shift in this global power architecture. What's going on? We see that UN, UNESCO are losing power. They are not setting the norms anymore. They are not setting the agenda. They are very strongly influenced, especially by the big corporations. So the corporatism is shaping our lives, our daily lives, but unfortunately also shaping the global agenda. When it comes to adult education, we see immediately the influences of the global corporations. It means also that we are losing multilateralism in a global governance. If UN and UNESCO are not so strong anymore, it means we as a countries are not represented there anymore. I mean, UN is still the only space where we have one country, one vote. Of course, some countries are equal and some are more equal. We know that. But still, at least, you know, there is a framework and that's something we can fight for. One country, one vote. Take the World Bank, take the OECD with the famous PISA and PIAC, $1, one vote. And of course, about corporations. I mean, Bill Gates and Microsoft, they're doing great work in education. But who is deciding? Well, Bill Gates, when he gets up in the morning and says, today I will invest in well, either vaccination or education of rural population in Ghana. It depends only on him. So there is no participation. There is no multilateralism, and that's probably the biggest shift that we are facing. And of course, the impact of neoliberal ideology, I mean, starting with Margaret Thatcher and Ronald Reagan, and then increasingly today, what we see is that neoliberal agenda is defining very much. We see it in our own language. We are talking about skills and competencies and achievements and performances and measuring. This is something we got from the neoliberal approach and the human capital theory. We are not people anymore. We are human resources. We are not educating and teaching. We are increasing capacities and so on. So outcomes are important, not the processes and so on. This is the impact of neoliberal agenda, and it's getting stronger. After COVID-19, it's getting stronger. Another very worrisome tendency, especially for us in education, is backlash in democracy and civic participation. There are very serious reports, like Amnesty International and other organizations saying during COVID-19, people lost lives, but we also lost a big part of democracy. Democracy is not representative anymore. There are some other powers taking over. It's not the people who is in the driving seat. So democracy is not working as it should be, and we have serious loss around the globe. Civic participation decreased. People are also moving. If they want to be active, they move outside of the system. They move to the streets, for good or for bad. It's not discussion within the system, which should be part of the democratic process. And of course, there is a whole list of the global problems. I will not go to them, but these rising inequalities, armed conflicts. In spite of all the efforts, you know, peace and peace and peace, we still have armed conflicts, a climate crisis, energy crisis, and so on. So we are not capable as a world to cope with this crisis. And that's what was missing in Marrakesh. What can adult education do to really help world and policymakers to cope with the crisis? And finally, I put here something that wasn't so obvious, but I believe if we take a look closer that we will see it everywhere. A kind of a postmodern paradigm that is shaping our life and work already for quite a long time. In order to avoid talking quite long about postmodernism and reminding you about main premises, I put this simple comparison between pre-modern, modern, and postmodern. And again, in adult education, we have embraced this postmodern, like, oh, it was learner-centered. It recognized individual approach, individuality. It recognized diversity of views, diversity of perspectives. So we have embraced this. This gave us some very, very good answers. But it turned, like the lifelong learning, it turned against us. And what are the risks that I would name here? First one is deconstruction of the relevance of science, because postmodernism says, look, science is only one of the paradigms. This is only one of the approaches. There are many others as well, and they all have equal right to exist. So you might think that the Earth is a globe, but you might also think that Earth is a flat. And that's happening. There are societies for the flat Earth, they have their annual conferences, and they have space. They get space. And many, many other theories and conspiracy theories. If science is only one of the approaches, then look what's coming. And we saw it. During COVID-19, we really saw it. And of course, as an expert, as a professional, you say, look, this proved to be good, vaccine or a medicament or anything. This proved to be very good. Science research proved to be very good. Experts are saying it's very good. You can say, well, no, that's not my view. And that's it. So we lose professionalism, this epistemological relativism. Everyone can decide what is truth and what is knowledge. For adult education, it's a real challenge. What are we going to teach if we don't have any part of this knowledge? The whole post-truth time, Trump can come and say, look, at my inauguration, it was the biggest number of the people ever. Next day, they showed the photo. He said, no, this is only alternative truth, alternative facts. It's not a lie. So there is no lie in truth anymore. Moral relativism, there are no universal values. So if you say, look, so human dignity everywhere, well, there are some cultures where human dignity is understood differently. If women are beaten, if there are, so any practices that we consider like not good for the human dignity, well, it's their culture. Everything is okay. Everything could be justified. Identity politics, particularism, all single groups deciding about which one is more oppressed and so on, and forgetting the big global problems. The cancel culture, restrictions of right to speech that we see even in academia and the university now, so we can finally ask ourselves, after this postmodernist plus neoliberal way, what is really the purpose of education? So we come to good old question, why education and what for? And that's the question that I will end up with. But open for your questions, of course. Thank you.
Draga Katarina, najlepša hvala za tole zgodbo, ne samo o Marakešu, ampak o izobraževanju odraslih danes in jutri. Predvsej napeta in veliko nevarnosti prežina nas, je pa ta zgodba izjemno pomembna zato, ker to, kar mi prejmemo iz mednarodne scene izobraževanja odraslih, so stebri, na katerih mi zasnujemo potem naša strokovna prizadevanja. In obratno, to, kar mi počnemo, ne samo primeri iz prakse, ampak vsa naša strokovna gledanja, to, kar zagovarjamo, je hrana za delo na mednarodni ravni. Tako da je izjemno pomembno, da smo povezani. Malce smo prekoračili urnik, ampak ali je kakšna pripomba, kakšno vprašanje, kaj zelo pomembnega? V Marakešu so bile naša direktorica Teja, Jasmina Mirčeva, tukaj danes ni, tukaj, ne. Tako da one iz prve roke, nekateri smo preko spleta spremljali tale forum civilne družbe. Civilna družba smo na nek način mi vsi, vsi, ki delujemo v izobraževanju odraslih na način, na katerega delujemo, ker dejansko verjamemo v to osredotočenost na učečega se, zagotavljanje pravic učečega se in tako naprej. Ema, izvoli.
Hvala. Katarina, hvala. Res, še posebej za ta zadnji del. Jaz sem zelo vesela, da razmišljanje seveda na teh vrhovih UNESCO gre v to smer, me pa seveda skrbi, tako kot vse nas, da ta svet gre v neke druge vode, ampak mislim si in jaz močno in srčno upam, da je tako na UNESCO v večini, ker je to, tako kot je rekla Zvonka, pot, ki nam riše smeri na nacionalni ravneh in seveda tudi na regijskih v posameznih delih sveta. In ta svet seveda je tudi pri nas doma. Pa me resno zanima, kaj pravzaprav kako razmišljajo vrhovi UNESCO. Navkljub vsemu, kar smo poslušali, kje so pravzaprav paradigme, kje so prelomi identitet, kje so prelomi ideologij, kaj si lahko obetamo? Hvala.
That's the question I'm asking myself all the time. And we think about UN and UNESCO as one body with a clear politics. That's not true. This is a big bureaucratic machine with different parts that have different approaches. And I mentioned this blue document is a reimagining our futures together. This document, like, you know, we would agree with every word and we would say, yeah, that's what we think. But it's not welcomed by many others in UNESCO. There are some in UNESCO who are more under the influence of these big corporations and more worried about financial stabilities. The others who are more fond of cooperation with civil society and academia. And we see how those paradigms are fighting, conflicting within UNESCO even. We see this shift between UIL, Hamburg, and Paris, and so on. So my proposal would be not to be passive and to wait, but to take an active part in this paradigm shifting. To say, as Wonka mentioned also, what we are doing here is contributing to that. So usually I say we need to do two things. First, our homework. Work on in our own countries on our own adult education. Use the recommendations, but then adapt also, make the best system we can and so on. Make it really human right. But then be also engaged globally. Going through the ministries, going through the national delegations, go to those bodies and raise the voice. Because they are there for us. UNESCO is there for us. They are our voice. So we should really be participatory, and even if we are not invited or welcomed, pushed for that, in order to take part in this paradigm shifting and not just passively waiting to see who will win, which school of thoughts will win in UNESCO.
Hvala lepa. Še Petra. To so teme, ki nas lahko zelo razunamejo.
Ja, hvala lepa, da mogoče samo eno misel ob tem. To, kar ste predstavili, se res zahvaljujem za ta, bom rekla, globji pogled na neke silnice, ki delujejo, ampak zdi se mi, da tukaj je veliko strahu, kaj bo v prihodnje, ampak tako, kot ste zdaj na koncu rekli, vidim to zadevo kot prebujanje planetarnega izobraževanja odraslih. Izobraževanje odraslih v Evropi ga kar poznamo, ali pa v Ameriki, ali pa v drugih delih sveta. Ampak kaj pa je planetarna paradigma? Se mi pa zdi, da ste zelo lepo, kako bi rekla, orisali vse te porodne bolečine, ki se zdaj v tem trenutku rojevajo. Torej, z tega rojevanja neke skupnosti, ki je seveda zelo različno razvita, kjer se bijajo verjetno ne samo dve paradigmi, mi kot zahodnjaki jih dve vidimo, ampak verjetno so še v ozadju nekatere, ki jih niste omenili, pa jih tudi ste občutili, pa na drugi strani v bistvu neka vizija prihodnosti. Kam pravzaprav, kaj izobraževanje odraslih kot sektor ali pa kot področje v bistvu sploh lahko družbi, ampak ne družbi v smislu državnih ureditev, ampak planeta človeštvu pravzaprav v resnici lahko prinese. In jaz bom tako rekla, zaključila s tem, osebno globoko verjamem, da izobraževanje odraslih je potrebno. Je potrebno, v vsakem primeru je potrebno. Zdaj pa mislim pa, da tisto, kar pa tudi moramo razumeti, je pa to, da bo moralo še iznajti temo, ki je najbolj ključna, planetarna, in pa metodo, ki jo bo v sodobnem času v bistvu zagovarjalo. Tako da hvala lepa.
Your observation is really good. And adult education is mushrooming, as a matter of fact. there are practices, there are forms, people are taking part. And there is a need, and it will go on. The problem is it's not recognized and it's not supported. So everywhere around the globe there is, for example, vocational education and training. We will never give it up because having a job, a decent job, is the basics of human dignity. Very often I fight with my colleagues in civil society, oh, forget about vocational, this is a dirty word. So, come on, so this is the basics. So that's very much needed, but we need to fight for adult education for a decent job and not only a drill. And that's what's going on around the globe. Or a global phenomenon, this climate education. In Marrakesh framework, yeah, very strong. But what's happening? If you read also Marrakesh framework, you will see, yes, we need to educate people, you know, there is about, not in framework, but we know it's about recycling, awareness raising, climate changes, why is it important to do something, and so on. But there is no single word about who are the big polluters. What about countries that pollute and the emission of CO2 unlimited? What about big companies? One big company can pollute more than millions of people worldwide. So nothing about everything, oh, you individuals, you do it. Adult education should help you to do it and to be aware and, you know, to develop skills for, you know, recycling, doing something for water, for air. Lovely. But what about big polluters? I think adult education should develop critical thinking. This is the most important task. And then we will be able to see who are the big polluters and what can we do about that. Of course, not neglecting individual level, but doing both.
Še eno vprašanje oziroma komentar, potem pa res gremo na naslednjo točko.
Najlepša hvala za vaše predavanje, še posebej mi je bila všeč ta družbeno-kritična nota, opozorilo na to dekonstrukcijo vloge znanosti v prostoru. Na koncu ste postavili vprašanje in sicer, kaj naj bi bil temeljni namen izobraževanja odraslih. Mislim, da delček ali pa vsaj ena izmed pomembnih namenov bi bil spodbujanje razvoja kritičnega mišljenja. In tukaj, če bi dobili množice kritičnih, bi lahko spreminjali svet.
I can just agree with that, really. I mean, this constructivist view, of course, we are glad to embrace different perspectives and views and so on, but I still believe science is what backs up. Maybe it's very traditional and old school, but I still believe in science and research with all the mistakes we make in science research. And that's what we should use as a basis for transferring the knowledge, but then not just transfer the information, but teach people to have critical communication with the knowledge we are giving them. And that would be the combination that I could subscribe to, as you said. Thank you.
Tako, hvala lepa, Katarina. Zdaj veste, zakaj tiste tri besede, a ne, strast, s katero deluje in govori, sočutje, ker pač ima opravka z ljudmi iz celega sveta in seveda tale modrost, ki si jo je nabrala. Tako da hvala res.